Hello, everybody. Welcome to UW River Falls and your new student registration day. My name is Alicia Ranky-Tudhill. I'm Manager of Ability Services here on campus, and I'm going to give you a basic overview of our office and how to get connected with services. So in terms of accessing services, when we're thinking about accommodations at the college level, one thing to recognize that is really important is to understand that students are required to independently seek out services. There's no way for our office or staff to know if a student has a disability without that disclosure or them independently seeking out services. So that is something that is a pretty big transition from the high school level to the college level. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about connecting with our office and those steps. Another thing that we do require is that students provide additional documentation to support their needs for accommodations, right? So we usually do ask for that information to be provided from a licensed clinical professional who understands the nature and the need for that accommodation that the student is requesting. So we'll talk a little bit more about general documentation requirements as we move along in the PowerPoint, but know that you are required to submit documentation to support the need for your accommodation request. An IEP or a 504 plan is a really helpful tool for us to get started, but in order for us to make the best determination that we can about what level of support or accommodations may be required for the student, we again ask for that documentation via our collaborative document form or other measures. And understand that accommodations do not directly transfer from high school to college, and the terms IEP and 504 plan go away. Those are not things that or language that we specifically use to identify that. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about language and when you're asking, how do I get my IEP or 504 plan? That's a great place to start, but note that those terms are not used anymore. When we're talking about preparing for an intake appointment, we want students to be able to explain independently their diagnosis and how that affects them or impacts them academically. That's a huge part of the process. And so it's important that students recognize that there's two ways in which we make determinations about accommodations. One is the information that they provide us, right? So their self-report. And the other part of that is the documentation. So the information that the student discloses, what the barriers are, what their learning styles are, what challenges they may face due to their disability in higher ed. Those are conversations that we really want students to engage in during that intake appointment. There's been plenty of times where I've been sitting in meetings with parents and students, and the parent may be responding for the student. And we really do want students to be their own advocate and have their own voice in this process. Students are more than welcome to bring a parent or a family member to help support them with that intake process, but know that generally we do want to hear from the student and making sure we understand from their perspective what it is that they need, along with, again, their strengths and learning styles so we can best support them. The last area here that we'll touch a little bit on is that students are required to distribute something called a faculty notification letter, which is essentially how a faculty member finds out about the accommodations that the student receives. And so as we go through this PowerPoint, I will go into a little more detail about how that process will work for the individual student. So as I mentioned in the previous slide about the documentation, this is the general sort of basic information and documentation requirements that we have outlined for students. And before I even get into reading these or reviewing these, I do want to inform you all that it is by no means meant to be overly invasive or overly difficult to get accommodations at the college level, but what we do want is some context and guidance on what it is the student needs. I conduct all intakes on campus, and so if I've only met a student one time, which is typically the time it takes to review and determine accommodations, I don't have a lot to go on, right? So it's really helpful to have not only the information that the student tells me, but also that background information, history, context, all that stuff that helps me get a better idea of what it is the student needs here on campus, not only from an accommodation standpoint, but other resources and guidance that we may be able to provide to the student. But generally speaking, we want the documentation to be recent and comprehensive. We want to make sure that we identify what the impairments are and if that does impact one or more major life activity, in major life activities can range from anything from learning, hearing, speaking, sleeping, concentrating. There's a really, really long list of things that are included in a major life activity, but we need to understand what that impairment is and how that impacts the student. What does that look like today? How is that affecting them academically? And then the other part of that, describing the specific accommodations necessary for the student as a result of the disability, right? So making that connection to what the issue is, and making sure that that concern is a direct result of the student's diagnosis or disability. And then we do ask that that documentation be submitted from a licensed clinical professional who is familiar with that impairment or condition. So if you have a psychiatric disability, we'd hope that your psychiatrist or your therapist or your licensed clinical social worker would be providing that documentation, as they are a qualified professional to complete that. The big question that I always get with this slide or talking about documentation requirements are for some of those disability categories where there may not be an active provider or there may not be active ongoing treatment. And so for things like learning disabilities, for example, oftentimes you're not going to be working with a provider long term. So you may not have documentation that is overly recent within the last few years, right? So typically what we ask for, if you have a learning disability and you qualify under that standard, we ask for the most recent evaluation that was conducted by the school district. And if you do have any initial documentation that that supports the need of when it was conducted, the initial testing evaluations, the most recent evaluation conducted from the school district is really a great place to start if you fall into that category. So no, when I say general, there are some flexibilities built in there, and it may not necessarily always look exactly the same. But please recognize that we by no means want to make it difficult, but we do want to make sure we're verifying and understanding the needs of the student in the best way that we possibly can. So what is an accommodation? So the important thing I think about this is kind of identifying what an accommodation is at the high school level and the college level. If you are watching this, then you probably have a general idea that, again, it's typically an adjustment in the way things are done, not an adjustment in the curriculum, right? If you're watching this, then you probably have a general idea of what that is. I think the important thing to recognize when we're thinking about accommodations at the college level compared to accommodations at the high school level is that accommodations are to provide equal access and opportunity for the student at the college level, right? We just provide students a level playing field and equal access to another student who would not have that impairment, right? And we are not at a point where we would ever be able to guarantee that the student is successful. We have specific parameters and guidelines that we need to follow to ensure that we are meeting the needs of the student, but we're also not compromising the integrity of the course. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So accommodations versus modifications. And one thing that I will say, just to clarify this before I go into more detail, is that this reasonable accommodation list only lists more of our general type of accommodations that we have. If we look at our evaluation reports for the types of accommodations we've offered or all the different things we provide, I mean, we've probably granted over 150 different types of accommodations since I've been here in 2.5 years. So know that these are just lists, right? We always consider accommodations on a case-by-case type of basis. There may be an accommodation we've offered 500 times, there may be an accommodation we've offered 2 times. But I do want you to know that there's a lot of flexibility in kind of how we make those determinations, and it's based on the needs of the student. And sometimes we need to evaluate what that looks like in the context of each individual course, depending on what the accommodation is. I think the other thing to recognize is the difference between modifications and accommodations. And so at the college level, right, we cannot modify or alter any content, right? So I think the example that I use the most is typically one that we will sometimes see as students are coming in with accommodations. For example, a student may have a writing disability, and they may be required as an accommodation to only complete 3 pages of a 6-page paper. So half of that, they have to write half of the typical word count or page count. Now at the college level, we can't do that. We can't reduce the number of questions. We can't alter what it's asking the student to do, and we cannot modify it. So keep that in mind. And if I do have an opportunity to connect early with students as juniors or seniors, I do encourage them to start kind of weaning those off and starting to evaluate how that looks under what accommodations would look like at the college level, right? If you're college bound. So things like testing accommodations like time and a half, distraction reduced testing location, those are always going to be, as long as there's a need for it based on the student's disability, are going to always be reasonable. And most of our students have those accommodations. But just keep in mind, if there's a lot of modifications and you feel like the information that I'm communicating applies to you, just understand that we can't modify or alter that at all. So when you're thinking about registration, when you're thinking about your course load, keep those things in mind, right? You may not be able to take the exact same course load, the 15 credit load, if you're used to having modified content, right? So just good information to know as you're thinking about registration for your courses in the fall. The other thing is exam retakes. So we do not allow a student to retake an exam. And again, we don't change the curriculum or the requirements to meet the needs of the student. Now, again, we try to find our best ways to provide reasonable accommodations to students, and we do work with our faculty very closely, our department chairs, our deans, to come up with reasonable solutions to issues that may arise. But generally speaking, these are the types of accommodations that are reasonable, and these are generally things that are not allowed. So this next slide is something that I like to share with incoming students and families to help them get a better perspective of the questions and the considerations that we have to review when we're thinking about granting an accommodation for a student. So an example that I like to give is our one-on-one presentation accommodation. But before I go into that, I do want to go over the first two things. So when we're evaluating any accommodation at the college level, the first thing is that it can't alter or change an essential element of what the assignment, course, or program is asking the student to do, right? That's number one. And so the example that I give is, so we have some students who have a one-on-one presentation accommodation, so the ability to present with the professor only rather than the entire class. Our primary disability campus, or the largest disability population on our campus, is psychiatric disability, and so that's an accommodation that we'll see. With this particular accommodation, though, understand that this may be determined on a case-by-case, course-by-course basis, right? So if an essential element of an assignment is nonverbal body language, presentation delivery, and the ability to communicate information to a group, it would be determined that offering the presentation in a one-on-one fashion would likely alter an essential element of what the course or assignment is intending to measure or ask the student to do. So the course that I'm kind of talking about here in this context is a speech course, right? So if a student signed up for a speech course and was asking for this type of accommodation, we likely would not allow it, because an essential component is the ability to deliver that content to a group, to provide that information regarding nonverbal body language, having that ability to communicate information to a group and respond appropriately. That is a core component of what the course is asking the student to do. Now, if we look at other courses, I say animal science because we have a lot of students who do animal science or science-based majors. And if the content of that evaluation is more based on the content rather than the delivery or the presentation of the student, then it's likely that we would be able to allow that accommodation. And we've allowed that accommodation for a lot of different courses. But I do want you to recognize that there may be some case-by-case sort of communication that may have to happen with the student, myself, the professor, depending on what the accommodation is, perhaps a department chair or a dean, to kind of all work together to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the course, right? And we're meeting the needs of the student. This down here, the accommodations cannot be retroactive. This next point is something that I really, really want to encourage first-year students to recognize. It's the idea that if you choose, right, to not use your accommodations your first semester, that's totally up to you, completely optional. But I do want you to recognize that accommodations do not go back in time to address something that happened before the student was approved for accommodations or before they elected to use them. So they can't go back in time, right? Like, so you may say, hey, I didn't have enough time on a test. I want to see if I can make that up, right? You made a conscious decision not to register with our office and not use that accommodation on that exam. We cannot go back in time and fix that, right? The accommodation process and the approval of those accommodations are only to address current and future academic concerns. And so if I was going to give a first year student advice about how to kind of handle this process, it's better to find out that you don't need them than you do. It's better to find out that, hey, I'm not sure next semester if I would need to use these. Again, I would encourage you to use them if you're doing well, right? That's probably one of the attributing factors as to why you did well. But obviously that's your decision. But that's better than finding out mid-semester that you're registering for your next round of classes and you've been put on academic probation and you're trying to kind of catch up, right, when possibly these accommodations could have supported you in a way when you would have not been in that position, right? So I just want students to recognize that that's kind of how they work, and it's really important, especially for first year students, to recognize that. Alrighty, so the letter of eligibility, as we're kind of moving through some of the steps and expectations. When a student does an intake appointment, they submit the documentation, and I'll outline all the steps at the end of the session as well. Once they've submitted the documentation and done the intake process, a student will receive something called a letter of eligibility. And it means it's appropriate, that it addresses the impairment, and it's reasonable, right? It doesn't reduce an essential course or objective. So those are the measures that we use when we're determining whether an accommodation is reasonable or not. And that reasonable accommodation or accommodations will be put in that letter that will be distributed to the student. I always feel like the letter of eligibility is also a really good way for students to help recall what their accommodations are. Some students, even when they're coming to meet me for the first time, are really, really good about remembering what their accommodations are, what they had, what they used, what they didn't use in high school. And some students may struggle a little bit with that and may not recognize exactly what those things are. But at the college level, you should know what your accommodations are pretty readily. And if you can't remember, making sure you store that letter of eligibility somewhere appropriately so you have that. You'll get students will get a PDF copy sent to their student email of that letter of eligibility. A student only gets this one time. So if you're approved and you start as a freshman and you use it throughout your 4, 5, 6, whatever your collegiate career is here, you will only receive that once, notifying you that you've been approved, just so you know. With that being said, the other thing to kind of recognize when we think about engagement and we think about how students use our office or support, students have a lot of flexibility in how they use accommodations with us at the college level. We have some students who I will see somewhat regularly. They may want to check an appointment, they may want to follow up, they may want to review their accommodations, and so I may have more regular contact with them. And we have most students, I only meet formally with them one time, right? So the level of engagement or support is really what you feel like you need, right? If you do have a problem or a concern, please let us know immediately and we will work through that. But again, it's totally optional in terms of the way you want to use your accommodation and the flexibility that you have with that. Alrighty, so the faculty notification letter. So the difference between the letter of eligibility and the faculty notification letter is basically this. The letter of eligibility just states what the eligibility is for the student. Pretty straightforward, right? Only goes to the student, not to the faculty member. The faculty notification letter is basically a letter that states the type of accommodations the student is eligible for through our office. This is essentially how professors find out that a student has accommodations with our office. So with that information, know that as I said before, there is a lot of flexibility in how a student uses an accommodation. So we may find, so students can choose if they want to use accommodations in all their classes, none of their classes, some of their classes. But know that in order to receive any accommodations in a course, a student needs to distribute their faculty notification letter to their professor. If they do not give them that letter, they will not be accommodated in that course. That's how they find out. And that is also the student's outward request for an accommodation. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit different than what a student may be used to coming from the K-12 level, where a lot of that is already done for the student. This is not the case at the college level, right? So if you want to use accommodations, know that there's some level of responsibility on the student, and with that same level of responsibility is a lot of flexibility and decision making about how the student wants to take control of their accommodations and use them. We do require, not require, we do suggest that students visit with their professors during office hours or some other time to talk about their learning needs and how that impacts them or affects them academically. And the reason why I say that is because the letter that gets distributed to the professor is really relatively basic. As it states right here, there isn't any information regarding a student's diagnosis information, which is really good in the fact that it's completely confidential. The student has a right to disclose what or if any information they feel is necessary, right? That's their right. But on the other side of that, no, don't make the assumption that they're going to know necessarily how to support you in every way without having some level of information. So if you know that you're really good with structure and routines and visuals, and that's a really big part of your learning process, you may want to inform your professor of that. Hey, by the way, I just wanted to give you a heads up that if the course is structured and organized, I'm really good about following along, but if things are not as structured, it's harder for me to kind of keep up and harder for me to know exactly what I need to be doing, right? And so I think it would be helpful if we had an opportunity to check in a couple times throughout the course of the semester to make sure I'm on the right track. And that's by no means required, what I just said, but those are conversations or things that you should be thinking about how can I best support myself by letting them know what is relative information that may help them help me, essentially, right? So again, not required, but a really good tool or idea to kind of start thinking about as you're making those decisions. FERPA is something that you'll likely hear as you're going through all the virtual information in Canvas for new student registration, but basically know that it protects the student's right to privacy concerning their records, and that this information is covered by grades, financial aid, class schedule, conduct records, and know that any disability or office-related information pertaining to our office falls under the same guidelines, right? So we cannot share any information about a student without their permission, with a parent, a guardian, a friend, without their permission, right? So just keep that in mind, that we are under that same umbrella. And the other thing that I would note too is that if a student is struggling and you want to find out if they're struggling, if you call us, it's very unlikely that we're going to have that information. The only way that we would know if a student is struggling, if a student has disclosed that specifically to us. We would hope that you would encourage some level of communication where you're both feeling comfortable communicating concerns as they come up. So just know that you can connect with us, but we may not have the information that you may need, and we may not be able to disclose that to you without having a release signed off on by the student. So, but we do have some students who have their parents sign a release form so they can talk with us and share information. That's totally up to the student to make that decision of whether or not that's something that they would like to pursue. But generally know that we fall under the same privacy, records, and distribution of information as other offices on campus. So this is the steps and the final information that we typically talk about when we're trying to figure out what to do next, right? So the next step. So when a student is wanting to start our process, they will go to the homepage of our website and fill out our new student application. The new student application basically helps us get some background information on the student, what level of supports they need, what level of information they need to help inform us what that process looks like. It also has the student kind of fill out some questions about the accommodations they've had before, accommodations they're requesting now, and having them answer a few questions about how their disability impacts them academically, and also indicating what other resources on campus do they want to know more about. So that new student application is something we ask students to complete before they have an intake appointment with our office. At that time, you do have an opportunity to upload documentation to the application. So a student can do that at that time. If there's a copy of a 504 plan, there's the collaborative document that's been formed, a recent evaluation that was conducted, you do have the opportunity to upload documentation. Due to the nature of how things are right now, with the virtual registration and staff working primarily remotely, we are not accepting in-person documentation at this time. So all documentation will need to be either scanned or faxed. And so just keep that in mind as you're doing that. And that kind of leads to this next part where we typically ask students to call instead of an intake appointment. But as it stands right now, we are having all students email us to set up that intake appointment just due to the nature of how things are. So our process has shifted a little. So keep that in mind and bear with us as we're kind of working through some of those changes as well. The student will conduct the intake appointment, as I talked before. The culmination of that documentation and information is reviewed and assessed, and then a letter of eligibility is created. And that information is then distributed to the student's email, informing them of the approved accommodations that they've received. The other thing to keep in mind too is that a student is only required to submit documentation one time to support their need for accommodations. They are not required every year to continuously submit updated documentation and information. If there is a need for a new accommodation or a new diagnosis occurs, or there's some other new element that we need to address, we may ask for new documentation information if that's relative or suitable, but almost always we don't need that type of information. So generally it's only one time we need that. Then once that letter of eligibility is created, we have students set up a final meeting to review their approved accommodations. Usually that's when the student comes to campus, and that gives the student the opportunity to really understand, how do I use the approved accommodations that I've been granted? How do I use my testing accommodations on campus? How do I request my audiobooks? What does this note-taking accommodation look like for me, right? So making sure that when we approve them, that students understand appropriately how to use them. We would never want to approve an accommodation for a student without having them fully understand what that means. And so that's what that accommodation review meeting is. And then after that meeting, that's the opportunity the student would have to distribute their faculty notification letter to their professors. So once they do that and they distribute those to every professor they want to use their accommodations in, they are good and set and ready to go. If you have any other questions about how to get started with our office, I'm Alicia Ranky Tuthill, the Manager of Ability Services, and welcome to campus.